Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. As always, I'm your host Simon. Welcome. This is Polybius, which I would absolutely be pronouncing Polybius, and I'm sure I will throughout this episode. But Danny, who wrote today's episode, has given me a handy pronunciation guide. This is the killer arcade game that got erased from history. Strap in, everybody, let's get going. Format of the show, by the way, Danny writes it, I read it, never read it before. We're going to explore it together. We're going to decode it, if you will, dear audience. Let's jump in. If you ever find yourself stumbling around the cobwebbed corners of a spooky old retro arcade, there are two vintage gaming machines which are to be avoided at all costs. The first is Space Invaders because it's awful and plays like a pig. The other is the slightly more obscure 1981 video game Polybius, and the reasons are far more perilous. Sorry, I know we're very early for a tangent. There's one thing I want in my life that I haven't yet acquired. There are many things. I say that like I have everything I ever wanted. There's a 1990s pinball machine modeled like the theme is Star Trek The Next Generation. I've played it many times. I'd love to buy one. Those things are outrageously expensive. They're like $7,000, which I think I could just about stomach for having something so extremely cool. But apparently the maintenance is a pain in the ass because it'll be like, oh yeah, that light's gone out. And it's like an incandescent bulb specifically made for pinball machines, American pinball machines, no doubt, in the 90s. So sourcing that replacement part and having it repaired apparently is just an incredible nightmare. So I know I would buy the machine, I'd have it for about a year, some shit would break, and then I'd never get it fixed, and it would just be sitting there in my office just doing nothing. And I'd just look at it and feel shame and disappointment in myself every single time. Just before we continue, quick word from our fantastic sponsor, Saily. Look, roaming fees are super expensive. You check a map and the next thing you know, you've got like 15 quid added to your mobile phone bill. You're like, oh, what happened? Why? It was just a map. I didn't mean to have the satellite imagery load. But all of that can be happily forgotten with today's sponsor. Saily is an app that gives you instant mobile data in over 190 countries. It works via eSIM, meaning no plastic cards, no airport SIM kiosks, and no installing a new eSIM every time you cross a border. You just download once, you pick a plan, and you're good to go. They've got global, regional, and country-specific plans, all way cheaper than what your mobile carrier charges. You also avoid shady vendors and random Wi-Fi hunts. I've used it while traveling. It connects fast, works in every country that you go to, and you don't have to think about it again, which is exactly what you want from technology, isn't it? Get 15% off with the code DECODING. Download the Saily app or go to saily.com/decoding. Again, that's code DECODING at checkout for 15% off. And now back to today's episode. Depending on who you talk to, Polybius was dangerously addictive, could make you seriously ill, infected the player's brain with subliminal messages, and was capable of producing intense psychoactive effects. Honestly, sounds kind of awesome. Not only that, it was linked to the mysterious disappearances and even deaths of several children who dared to play it before the plugs were permanently pulled from the sockets just a month after it was launched. For the next couple of decades, it was difficult to find any reference material for Polybius, because the very existence of the game appeared to have been wiped from history. Dun dun dun! The presence of men in black suits who had hovered around the cabinets during the game's brief stint in the arcade sparked speculation that Polybius was actually a cunning facade for either a secret military recruitment drive or a government-funded mind control experiment that perhaps went slightly wrong as too many players lost all their lives, or at the very least, lost their minds. No, I don't believe it. Like the men in black suits and stuff, it's like, apparently the Secret Service, right, who protect the president, they're always wearing those suits and sunglasses, except they're not. They wear whatever's is most appropriate to blend in. So I don't know if it's true, but if like big DT's out on the golf course, the Secret Service are not necessarily going to be dressed in suits around him. They're going to be dressed in like golfing attire and, you know, ready to defend him and not look like obvious Secret Service. So I don't think if the CIA's putting like Polybius gaming machines with the idea of infecting the minds of the youth, that they're just going to send CIA agents dressed in suits with big CIA badges around their neck. They're going to find like the 20-year-old guy in the office, get him to put on a pair of fucking Vans and head down to the arcade and take some notes. And it wasn't until the dawn of the millennium that retro gaming enthusiasts began to publicly ponder what the hell had been going on with Polybius. Whilst it may be easy to instinctively assume that all of this was either just a hoax concocted many years after the supposed event, or perhaps just another example of the cheating memory, the curious thing about the Polybius conspiracy is that so many elements of the story are based on surprisingly real events. Honestly, these are my favorite kind of videos, where it's like, ooh, maybe there's something to this one. Like the JFK assassination, where it's like, I don't know what happened, but it's fucking weird. There was indeed some secretive, sinister shit going down in American video arcades of the 1980s. It's just a matter of assembling all the correct data and being careful not to shove it all into a conspicuously crooked cabinet of curiosities. Be warned that you may be subject to some subtle subliminal messaging throughout the course of this video as we attempt to untangle the chaotic snarl of wires around the back of the most treacherous video game in history. Winners don't use drugs. Oh, Danny, winners do use drugs. They use performance-enhancing drugs. Have you never heard of Lance Armstrong, Danny? Mysterious Island. I can already sense the eruption of frothy outrage from hordes of retro gaming nutters following my slightly facetious dismissal of Space Invaders in the opening paragraph. I don't think I've ever played Space Invaders for more than 5 minutes, but I wasn't desperately impressed. Speaking as a retro gaming nutter myself, I of course appreciate that Taito's 1978 game is one of the most groundbreaking and influential video games of all time. I was just pointing out that I find it hard to love or spend more than about 5 minutes playing. It's dreary and a sluggish, monochromatic snooze fest today. And yes, that's easy to say about a 47-year-old video game, but Space Invaders already felt massively out of date following the release of Galaxian just 1 year later in 1979, which was far more colourful and lively. Oh my god, it's really weird that 1978 was nearly 50 years ago. I wasn't born in 1978, but I do feel it creeping up on my birthday of 1980. This is my birthday tomorrow. I'm 38 years old. But like I say with my height, it's like, yeah, no. Whenever someone mentions about 7 foot, I'm like, yeah, about my height. I'm just going to start saying that I'm 28 from now on. And no one will know the difference because I am the picture of youth. The thing is that 1981 was still a primitive era for arcade games, and so nobody could have expected anything too jaw-dropping from Polybius. And we were several years away from games as sophisticated as Paperboy or Bubble Bobble. This was before the concept of a video game being a challenge you were meant to complete with the ultimate goal of reaching the end screen. Back then, players were shoving their 10-pence pieces or quarters into the endless and simplistic scenarios of Asteroids, Pac-Man, Frogger, and Defender, with the aim of just trying to stay alive for as long as possible to grab the prestigious top spot on the high score table. Yeah, honestly, I kind of prefer these kind of games which don't have an end. Like, I'm not a big fan of story games where you go through and you do the story. I like mission games where you go and do missions, racing games, building games, strategy games. But like story games, it's like, I can like them, but I don't love them. If you were really good at a particular game, you could potentially be hogging that cabinet for hours on end and probably wouldn't be very popular with the owners of the arcade. But trying to stay alive for as long as possible may have been trickier than usual when you were playing Polybius. I could already see a good reason why Polybius might have been largely forgotten for so long, and that's because anybody who lived outside the suburbs of Oregon, Portland would have been unlikely to have ever seen it. Whilst there are a few rare reports of the machine supposedly turning up in other locations, the general consensus is that it only popped up for a very brief time in 1981 in several arcades scattered around Portland. It hardly landed with a bang though. Whilst every other arcade game in the joints would have been plastered with vivid artwork of flying saucers and aliens and giant centipedes, the design of the Polybius cabinet was decidedly minimalist, to say the least. Some recall that it was entirely black, with zero branding or imagery or lettering, resembling something along the lines of a mini monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. The same people also tend to claim that the screen was entirely black and didn't flicker into life until you rolled in your quarter. That seems a bit unlikely to me, as the cabinet would surely have gathered dust quickly when most people would have assumed that it was out of order and swiftly moved on to Donkey Kong. A more popular recollection is that whilst the cabinet was indeed mostly black, it did bear the title of Polybius on the marquee at the top, and the sole surviving screenshot of the game, widely circulated online, is the title screen, which again, strangely minimalistic. Whilst other games would have usually fallen into attract mode when nobody was playing, oh, is that what it's called? Where it's like showing you the best bits of the game and stuff, so you're like, ooh, that looks fun. Showing off a demonstration of the game to get another customer digging into their pockets, Polybius just depicted a blank title screen, which included nothing more than the name of the game, the copyright date, and the name of the company that produced it. And we're not talking about a well-known name here, such as Nintendo or Sega or Atari. The outfit was, oh my, Sinneslöschen. Sounds German. Which has a whiff of German about it. There we go, a country not usually seen as a major manufacturing hub for arcade video machines in the 1980s. The lack of an attract mode obviously meant that a newcomer to the game wouldn't have a clue what the game was about until they parted with their quarter. That was a bit of pocket money gamble for a young kid, as you could end up playing something as amazing as Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom, or you could end up stuck with educational tripes such as Professor Pac-Man. Sounds terrible. Which itself quickly drifted into obscurity for more understandable reasons. Yeah, no one's going to the arcade to learn. But even 44 years later, we still don't really have that much of a clue what the game was like. A few people have suggested that it was a 3D rotating puzzle game with mazes that were similar to the layout of Pac-Man, but the majority of people who have fuzzy memories of the game recall that it was more of a fast-paced psychedelic shooter with dizzying flashing lights, strobe effects, spinning geometric shapes, and hypnotic visuals that were enough to make you hurl all over the control panel. Whilst there are lorry loads of Reddit users who have strived to give more in-depth details on this admittedly vague premise, the problem is that none of them really match up with each other. One point that most players can agree on is that the closest companion can be made with Atari's revolutionary 1981 game Tempest, which is another example of a vintage title that holds up well today. If you've never played Tempest before, it's quite tricky to explain, and I'm hoping that the editor might be able to throw up some footage of the game at this point. Instead of a joystick, you used a rotary knob to move your blaster around vector graphics tubes, which gave an illusion of a three-dimensional effect as you blasted your enemies to pieces. Perhaps the best way of describing it is to imagine that you're whizzing around the edges of a spider's web and shooting at the targets that are emerging from the center and coming right at you across the various trails of the web, growing bigger and bigger as they get close to you. I have to say, Danny, I'm quite struggling to imagine this in my mind. The game quickly evolved into a pretty frenetic experience and was a major breakthrough for vector graphic arcade games. And this brings us to another odd point about Polybius. Vector graphics games, which looked like simple line drawings forming wireframe or geometric shapes, were relatively rare, but there are a few cracking examples from this era, including Asteroids. Oh, okay, now I know what the vector things are. The tank simulator Battlezone, and of course Tempest. Most games, instead, made use of raster graphics, which deploy grids of pixels to create colorful but often blocky characters, as seen on something like Pac-Man or Burger Time. Is this about Polybius, Danny, or is this about 1980s video games? The thing is that games were produced from one or the other, as the monitors were manufactured to exclusively handle either vector or raster graphics. And yet many players recall that Polybius somehow used both, as there were some levels which involved hurtling through disorientating vector tunnels at ridiculous speeds, while other levels involved swirls of vivid color and pixelated sprites, which could only have been depicted on a monitor that could handle raster. If this was true, it would have been a pretty impressive achievement from the little-known manufacturer of Sinneslöschen. Sinneslöschen. The road to enlightenment is long and difficult, so take plenty of snacks. Oh, I see. Is this another one of those subliminal messages, Danny? But I'm like, what? But none of this leaves us with a very clear picture of Polybius, aside from a few clues that it may have played a bit like Tempest and felt either like a fiercely intense high-octane shooter or a kaleidoscopic and disorientating acid trip through space on a rocket powered by cream of magic mushroom soup, or both. Cream of magic mushroom soup sounds fun and delicious. But however the game played, it certainly proved to be popular, remarkably popular, maybe even dangerously popular. It was said that long queues formed in front of the cabinet, often breaking out into full-scale brawls over whose turn it was supposed to be. I'm pretty sure that a punch-up in the arcades is nothing unusual in itself. I must have witnessed a few myself, but this felt different. These people were giving each other a proper pummeling whenever they thought they might have to wait a few more minutes for their turn on Polybius. This might seem to suggest that the game wasn't just particularly good, it was downright addictive to the point where it was sparking an early example of video game rage from players desperate to score their next fix. The subliminal messages that occasionally flash quickly onto the screen may have had a part in fueling the addiction, as one of the more regularly spotted messages was, "You love this, you need this." Holy shit, okay? You need this game, you need it. Buy it now, spend your money, child. Whilst others included obey government, follow orders, never question authority, and join the Navy. But addiction was one of the milder symptoms of playing Polybius. Some of the side effects of playing the game for too long were insomnia, migraines, night terrors, hallucinations, and amnesia. It's not too surprising that the game triggered seizures in players with photosensitive epilepsy, and there's nothing particularly mysterious about that. But one of the stranger reported side effects included, quote, the inability to become sad. Sounds awesome. In sharp contrast to this, other players were said to have developed suicidal thoughts or lost control of their own minds. Perhaps the strangest side effect of all was experienced by one guy who became so traumatized by the game that he went on to become an anti-video game crusader, which is arguably an illness in itself.
Traitor!
There were also hushed rumors of young players vanishing without trace after playing the game, many of them later presumed dead. Hushed rumors. Speculation. Probably did happen. The Radiotopia Network's Showcase podcast produced a 7-part series in 2017 called The Polybius Conspiracy. Holy a 7-part podcast series in 2017. I feel like that was ahead of its time, which managed to track down one of the individuals who briefly went missing in 1981. Bobby Feldstein claimed that he had been suffering some dizzying side effects while playing Polybius at the age of 14 in the Coin Kingdom arcades in Portland, apparently one of the dodgiest, rundown arcades in the region. He was feeling so weird that he eventually packed it in and set off for home, but he sensed that something sinister was happening to his brain and that he was no longer safe. He made it to his home in Tillamook State Forest, but nobody else was around to save him from getting seized by a group of silent strangers who dragged him out of the house as Bobby blacked out. He awoke to find himself tied up and trapped in a series of underground tunnels, but he wasn't alone. His bonds were later broken by a badly bashed up boy who appeared to be a fellow prisoner. This sounds like a story that a kid made up. How old was this kid? 14 years old. Kind of sounds like the sort of thing a 14-year-old would make up, to be honest. They tried to make their way out of the tunnels, and Bobby felt that they were being pursued the whole time. It's not clear what happened to the other boy as he disappeared or was quite possibly recaptured before Bobby eventually located an exit and discovered that he was in a forest around 60 miles or so from Portland. He managed to make the long journey back home to find that absolutely nobody, not even his family, believed his account of why he had gone missing. Hey, guess what, Bobby? Me neither. Sorry. Bobby Feldstein told the audience of the Polybius Conspiracy podcast that the experience ruined his life, but he now exercises his demons by conducting walking tours around Portland in which he recounts his story to anyone willing to listen. I'm sorry, Bobby, but you seem like a nice enough chap from what limited stuff I know about you, but I just don't believe you. These silent strangers may not have been your run-of-the-mill kidnappers who chase after children and then drop them in tunnels around 60 miles away, which I often felt was incredibly irritating during my own childhood. Sounds like Danny doesn't believe Bobby either. There's a feeling that an organization with power and influence was working behind the scenes on hiding the secretive, ulterior motive that was buried in these Polybius cabinets. Many players recall that the game regularly attracted visitors who stood out from the usual crowd like a packet of glow-in-the-dark condoms and a claw machine. These silent men in black suits weren't there to play games. They didn't seem bothered about striking up conversation with anyone, and they didn't seem interested in collecting any coins from the back of the machine. They didn't even bother to intervene when the inevitable fistfights broke out and everyone started punching each other in the face. Instead, they simply stood there with clipboards observing the players and gameplay while scribbling down notes, presumably along the lines of, this one shows potential, this one will lose his mind, and some idiot just lobbed another hot dog in my direction. It's like, all of these guys going to sign right up for the Navy. I'm really struggling to believe this one. It's also said at the end of the day, the men in black suits would open up the back of the cabinet and retrieve a small black device, which may possibly have been collecting all the valuable data from the recent playing sessions. By the time the arcades opened up again the next morning, the men were already in position again at either side of the cabinet. What, just standing there? This just feels like, I don't know, a story made up by a teenager. I suppose it's not out of the question that these men, so vividly recalled by so many players, could just have been representatives from Sinnesloschen, or however you pronounce that, and were there to assess the popularity of their game. Their mission may have been to ascertain whether it was worth rolling out the machines beyond Portland, Oregon. But a more popular theory is that their mission might have been a little more important than that. It could have been the case that Polybius was actually a covert military endurance test to track down the most promising candidates in Portland. The players who truly excelled at this battering of the senses were later invited to join the US military, while the ones who failed were dumped in tunnels around 60 miles away. Why would they do that? They just wouldn't. They'd just be like, nah, okay, well, there's that guy. We want that guy. And then they'd take him into their secret CIA program or whatever for extremely gifted teenagers? That might seem like a seriously flawed recruitment process, bearing in mind that the average regular visitor to the arcade would have been about 14. Yes, exactly! On a more sinister note, the Men in Black had been working for the infamous Project MK Ultra, orchestrated by the CIA from the 50s onwards, in which unwitting humans were used as guinea pigs in a series of shocking mind control experiments that ran for decades. Polybius itself may have been some kind of brainwashing tool in which the young players, many of whom reportedly lost their minds after playing the game, were handing over quarters to get sucked into a devious operation designed to develop torturous new methods of interrogation. Right, via video games. If that's the case, we should all be thankful that the experiment didn't last very long. Just 1 month after Polybius first landed in Portland and started sending everybody around the bend, the same men in black marched into the arcades and removed every machine, quite possibly peeling off the hands of every young player who was screaming for one last hit. And from that point onwards, it was as if Polybius never existed at all. There are some who reckon they've seen old Polybius machines in warehouses and storage lockers, with one member of the Vintage Arcade Preservation Society even claiming that he clocked the serial number on the back of a cabinet, which just happened to be 666. Right, of course. Because the CIA and the military and join the Navy and devil worship, because sure, why not? Let's throw in another, weird bit of conspiracy. But all these claims only really began to surface about a couple of decades later, following a period of complete silence. Since then, Reddit has become swamped with stories of users who remember playing Polybius, but it's hard to take them too seriously, particularly the ones who make out that the machine carried on working even after the plug had been pulled out of the socket. It didn't because, it could have a big battery in there, I suppose. I suppose it could just have a battery, couldn't it? And the lack of any contemporary documentation makes it tricky to get a proper grip on this swiveling joystick, as the authorities clearly made a good job of erasing the game from history. We don't know exactly how the game played, the true purpose of the machine, or anything about the shadowy company Sinoslotion, who didn't appear to have ever released anything else. And we don't know who coded the game, although one likely candidate that keeps popping up in discussion is Atari designer Ed Rotberg, who helped to develop a string of all-time classics, such as the groundbreaking vector graphics game Battlezone. As Ed Rotberg was working exclusively for Atari at the time, this has led some to conclude that Sinoslotion was actually a secret subsidiary of Atari, who didn't want their real name plastered across a cabinet that was turning players into packs of wild animals. But I think we're going to have to do a little more poking around the back end of Polybius to find out how much fantasy has blended in to quite surprising truths and address the question of whether such a game ever made it into the arcades in the first place. Ooh, so could this all just be entirely, not real? Never burn your bridges unless you're being chased by a pack of angry trolls. Congo bongo. Here's a straight answer to a straight question. Does a game called Polybius definitely exist? And the answer to that is an emphatic yes. In fact, there's at least 2 games that go onto that title, but the problem is that neither of them are the 1981 original and are in fact tributes to the legendary game that may or may not have been real. The first one was a freeware game for Windows released in 2007 by Rogue Synapse, a company with a bit of a reputation for turning fantasy into reality, as they were also responsible for creating a real arcade cabinet version of the fictitious game at the heart of the glorious 1984 space opera movie The Last Starfighter, 23 years after the film was released. I know nothing about any of the stuff, these old movies and games. They were before my time, and I never got into them. I play some retro games. I play some retro games today that I enjoy. Red Alert 2, played that a few years ago. Sim Tower, classic. SimCity 2000, yes please. But those are 90s. The owner of Rogue Synapse went as far as to acquire the name for Sinoslotion, almost the same as the original alleged manufacturer, but missing the funny umlaut, and created a new legal entity under the same name. Well, you can't have an umlaut in a domain name, right? It's just got to be regular A to Z. A to Z? What am I? American A to Z. The game itself was an attempt to recreate the psychedelic Polybius game as it might have existed in 1981, based on the notes provided by Stephen Roach, a coder who claimed to have worked on the original version. More on him in a bit. But the end result was not so much an enthralling game, but just an utterly bewildering experience. A better-known version of Polybius was written by the legendary Jeff Minter in 2017 and released for the PlayStation 4 with VR support. The funny thing here is that Jeff Minter was the first person who popped into my mind as a potential candidate for writing the original Polybius, as the reported trippy nature of the game sounded right up his interstellar highway. I can remember the hippie Jeff Minter, often nicknamed Yak, from the 1980s when he released a long, luminous library of deliciously surreal shooters for the Commodore 64 under his own label, Llamasoft. I don't, Danny. I was about to say that he was one of the most celebrated coders of the 8-bit era, but I might be getting a little carried away there. He very much existed outside the mainstream, and the early days of Llamasoft involved literally just himself and his mother working from home and packing up all the games for distribution. Wait, so he programmed them and made them in his own house? Or did he program them? He probably programmed them. sent them away, and then got like a load of them back, right? He wasn't like running Why did I think he was running like a games factory in his house? That makes no sense. Jeff Minter's games were perhaps aimed at a particularly niche market of gamers who enjoyed something out of the ordinary and were of little interest to the majority of young kids who preferred to buy any old crap with the word Robocop or Knight Rider plastered all over the packaging. I was a sucker for this. I'd be like, oh, a James Bond game. It must be good because it's James Bond. And it's like, they're just capitalizing on the fact that you like James Bond and there's a new James Bond movie out. It's kind of shitty. Although I did like those James Bond games, so maybe it set me right. GoldenEye was a cracking game for the N64. I'm completely wrong. I think all these kids are right buying Knight Rider and Robocop. Jeff's games also had a curious tendency to feature big hairy animals shooting each other to bits across vivid alien landscapes. Some of my own favourite Minter titles include Sheep in Space, Mama Llama, Revenge of the Mutant Camels, and Metagalactic Llamas Battle at the Edge of Time. That's a cracking title. In later years, his work has included a highly acclaimed update of Tempest for the Atari Jaguar in 1994. If you're American, Jaguar. Such a weird pronunciation of Jaguar. It's got 3 syllables, Americans. Jaguar. Jaguar. And a game called Space Giraffe for Windows in 2008. That's a step forward in time. What was he doing for 14 years? Just being lazy. He's still at it today, writing games for modern consoles and devices, and he seems the obvious choice to code a tribute to one of the most mind-melting games that has ever existed. When Minter's version was first announced, he declared, with tongue firmly in cheek, that he had been able to accurately recreate the original gameplay after he stumbled across a genuine working Polybius machine in a warehouse in Basingstoke in England. But he later admitted that the frenetic 3D VR shooter, which was also playable in 2D on a standard PlayStation 4, was more of a reimagining of what Polybius might have been. The game was incredibly well received, with several critics pointing out that certain elements of it were very similar to Tempest. I should give this a try. I've got one of those Oculus Quests, and or MetaQuests? MetaQuest 3, I think it's called. It's a great piece of kit. A lot of fun. And it was nice to see that Minter also inserted a few positive subliminal messages of his own into the game, including Holiday in Basingstoke, Scorn Lukewarm Tea, and, on a more controversial note, Resist Brexit. Of course, it's not out of the question that some people may have indeed spotted a working Polybius cabinet in recent years, but chances are that they have seen a relatively new custom-built cabinet with either the Rogue Synapse or Llamasoft Tribute versions of the game shoved inside. In order to try and find out if the original 1981 version was ever really doing the rounds in Portland, Oregon, it might be useful to track the exact point at which gamers suddenly started remembering it again after 2 decades of memory loss. Now, it's often reported that the earliest mention of Polybius online was in a Usenet forum back in 1994, although there's now no evidence of this at all in the Usenet archives. It seems more likely that the game's first online mention was in a brief entry on the video game resource website coinop.org, which is an attempt to document every arcade machine ever released. The post was dated 1998, although some have speculated that it was actually posted a bit later in 2000. Another theory is that it was really posted in 1998, but it took a couple of years for anyone to notice that it was there. Now, there's not an awful lot happening in the entry. We see a single image of the simple title screen, including the first online appearance of that 1981 copyright date and the company name Sinnesloshen, Inc. Many still believe this to be the only surviving legitimate screenshot from the game. The entry also briefly describes the game as weird-looking, kind of abstract, fast action with some puzzle elements, which, quote, had very limited release, 1 or 2 backwater arcades in a suburb of Portland. Okay, well, all seems to be adding up so far. The author admits that the history of Polybius is cloudy and is the subject of all kinds of bizarre stories involving kids losing their memories after playing it, guys in black coats collecting data from the machines, theories it was developed by the CIA as some sort of behavior modification program, and the sudden disappearance of the machines after just 1 month. Like, do I think the CIA is capable of this? Absolutely. The CIA has experimented on the American population many, many times without their knowledge. Like Danny, I think you mentioned MK Ultra. Do I think they'd do it this incompetently? No. No. I don't think they'd have the men in suits around. So that's what I don't think the CIA absolutely capable of it. Is it the CIA here? No, they'd do a better job, to be honest. You wouldn't know. We don't know for certain who actually wrote this summary, but the most likely suspect seems to be Kurt Koller, a guy whom you would presume really knew his microchips when it came to video games, as he had recently taken ownership of the coinop.org database. But the strangest thing about the entry is that at one point, Kurt Koller, or whoever it was, suggests that he owns the ROM image file of the game, which would make Polybius playable in an open source emulator, such as MAME, the multiple arcade machine emulator, on which I happily play thousands of old video games today, which I'm sure Danny has legitimately purchased. The retro arcade thing is like, it's such a copyright mess. Because, I don't know, I like playing some retro games, which I obviously source completely legally, but they are everywhere. Yeah, the entry gives no clues or details as to the gameplay, and seems to have been written by somebody who's never played Polybius in their life. A few years later, in 2003, we see the earliest known reference to Polybius in print, specifically in GamePro magazine, which ran an article entitled Secrets and Lies, that took a look at the biggest myths and legends in video games, such as the new Tomb Raider Easter egg in which Lara Croft supposedly got her kit off and revealed whether they were genuine or fake. Oh my god, I totally remember that rumor. It's believed that the segment on Polybius may have been the result of Kurt Koller getting in touch with GamePro to tip them off about the game and push for its inclusion. But the ultimate verdict from GamePro was decidedly inconclusive, and the magazine couldn't say for sure whether the game existed or not. However, it was this segment in a massively popular magazine which really propelled Polybius back into the public consciousness and led to the game evolving into a major talking point for many years to follow. So I think the question about whether it exists is, yeah, it existed. Even though people have like false collective memories and stuff, I feel there's enough here to say, yes, this game exists. I think Danny mentioned it. It seems pretty locked down. And then the argument about all of its weird powers is way less likely to be true. Everyone suddenly started remembering a brain-scrambling video game that was quickly pulled from the arcades, and the children of Portland who became violently ill after playing it, and the men in black suits who were regularly loitering around the machine and silently observing the chaos. There was one comment in particular which sparked more interest than most. It came from a bloke living in the Czech Republic. Oh, hello, countryman, who claimed to have been involved in the development of Polybius. Well, I say it was a comment. Originally posted on the Polybius entry on the coinop.org database in 2006 by a user called Stephen Roach, the end result was more like a rambling novella riddled with spelling errors and displaying little regard for punctuation. But Stephen Roach had quite a different take on the story, which had nothing to do with Men in Black or Project MKUltra or mind control experiments. He reckons that he and a few buddies set up Sinislotion Company in 1978, primarily working on components for printed circuit boards, although they did a bit of amateur coding as a sideline. They were approached in 1980 by a large South American company that he declines to name, but who were keen to hire Roach and his pals at Sinislotion to develop a new arcade game which would make use of pioneering graphics. By the way, Sinislotion does not sound like a Czech name for a company at all in any way. It sounds that there's no umlauts in Czech, so that umlaut above the O, this not adding up greatly so far. One of the team came up with the name of the game in tribute to the celebrated Greek statesman and historian Polybius, who lived between 200 and 118 BC, give or take a birthday. But the actual completed, funnily enough, it's my birthday today. Yay! But the actual completed game itself was causing a few concerns right from the beginning, as the board of directors over at the South American company were arguing over whether such a revolutionary new style game packed with such intensity might cause troubling side effects in kids who played it for long periods. After a brief delay, the arcade machine was given a very limited release of just 7 machines in Portland to test the waters. This all seems very reasonable, seems like a sensible rollout, just 7 machines, make sure we're not, causing children to have epileptic fits or something. But just 6 days later, the news broke that the 13-year-old boy had suffered an epileptic fit while playing the game, which sent the board of directors into panic mode as they believed that they'd unwittingly created a monster. I mean, what? So everyone who's ever manufactured a strobe light is creating monsters? It's like, no, people have epilepsy. It's a thing. That's why there's all those warnings about epilepsy. They paid a settlement to the boy's family and swiftly removed all the cabinets from the arcades, often battling against the protests of the young players who were now daring each other to have a go at the nightmare game. Some of the men who removed the machines may well have been wearing black suits. Yes, because people who work in business tend to wear black suits. As far as Stephen Roach was aware, there were no surviving ROM images of the game unless they're still buried somewhere in the vaults of the South American company that he refuses to name. And Roach claims that the whole saga turned out to be a crushing experience for his team. He believed they'd created something which would have changed the face of video gaming, albeit not suitable for people with epilepsy, but the game was buried and Sinneslotion was disbanded after receiving only a meager payment on the grounds that the game was so quickly withdrawn. That also doesn't seem to add up. You develop a video game, and then the company that's distributing it is like, no, we're not going to pay you because we didn't end up distributing it. It sounds like that's on you guys. You bought the game. I don't think that's how business works. Whilst quite a few truth seekers felt that this was the biggest new lead yet on the murky history of Polybius, not everyone was convinced, including the owners of the coinop.org database. They gave their own response on the Polybius entry in 2009, which made their feelings clear. We'll quote them here. "We just wanted to go on record here that Stephen Roach is full of himself and knows nothing about this game. We have it on good authority. We recently received some new information about the game, and yes, one of us is flying to the Kiev, Ukraine area tomorrow, and yes, the trip is related to this information. Stay tuned." All right, Kiev, quite far away from the Czech Republic. Also, I don't know Ukrainian at all, but again, Stomerschlossen or whatever it was, doesn't sound particularly Ukrainian. Or Russian, for that matter. I'm not sure how Kiev suddenly came into the equation, but if anyone did stay tuned, they're still waiting to hear about the outcome of the trip. When was this? 2009? 16 years and counting! I can only assume they fell under the hypnotic spell of a real Polybius game and never made the journey back. The owners of the database also pointed out in that same post that Polybius definitely wasn't some kind of early Tempest prototype, as many skeptics have been suggesting, and that it didn't even use vector graphics. But considering how much they were supposed to know about the game, the actual entry remained notably sparse on detail. Perhaps they were just annoyed that the Stephen Roach fella had popped out of nowhere and seized control of their own mythical joysticks. But here's a strange thing. The video game historian Kat Spira later discovered that there was a very real Stephen Roach who operated a company in Mexico in the 1990s that was meant to be a child reform academy. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead and say that feels like a different Stephen Roach. A polite way of describing this outfit would be a behavioral modification program, but a more accurate description might be a brainwashing program in which some kids were brutally beaten and deprived of sleep in an effort to control their minds and dramatically alter their personalities. I mean, again, I understand why there could be a connection drawn here, but it's extremely weak, and this does feel like a different Stephen Roach. Also, didn't he have involvings in business dealings with a South American company? Mexico very much in North America. So, interesting. As well as the facility in Mexico, Roach also apparently owned a similar facility in the Czech Republic, which is where the poster on the database claimed to live these days. Interesting. Now we're going from like, maybe it's a different Stephen Roach to, that's a hell of a coincidence, maybe it's the same Stephen Roach. However, his Child Reform Academy didn't exactly win any awards, and in fact, Roach and his wife were arrested in 1998 after 3 young girls escaped the facility and ran to the police with complaints of abuse. Roach and his wife were later charged with illegal child trafficking, child torture, fraud, unlawful confinement, and a string of other offenses to boot. But they fled from justice, have been on the run ever since. Holy shit. This got real, guys. You were like, yeah, I'm just posting on a forum about Polybius, and the next thing you're on the run from the authorities internationally because you're being accused of child torture. Holy shit, Stephen, what the fuck? It's interesting to ponder over whether this guy who specialized in brainwashing young children was the same guy who had earlier helped to develop a mind-altering video game. But it seems a little suspicious that he couldn't even decide on the correct spelling of his own company, Sinneslotion, in his appallingly written post, and none of his named colleagues have ever been traced. Of course, any old fool could have written their post under any name they liked, and a cynic might suggest that Kurt Koller, or one of his colleagues at the database, composed the message to take the saga in a new direction. And it's hard not to become overwhelmed with cynicism when you take a closer look at all the elements of the story that appear to point to Polybius being nothing more than a hoax that somehow took on a life of its own. Yeah, I think it was real. I think all of the stuff surrounding it is not. Basically, I think that's where I'm at right now. Maybe that'll change over the next few pages. Green Beret. It feels a bit fishy that an arcade game released in 1981 didn't get a mention anywhere in print until 2003, a few years after it was mentioned online. A Polybius believer might argue that this was down to the incredibly limited release of the game, which nobody bothered to document until coinop.org embarked on a mission to catalog every game in existence. But considering that children were supposedly falling violently ill or losing their minds or going missing during the single month that Polybius was in action, And considering that the game was so swiftly withdrawn in the controversial aftermath, you'd think that it would have warranted some kind of mention between 1981 and 1998. Yeah, even like a legal mention. Like, no one looked into this? If this was really happening, and it was serious, I feel like some sort of authorities would have been like, let's see what's going on here. And look, people would be like, well, Simon, it's the CIA. But I don't believe it's the CIA, do I? But no, we have yet to dig up a single contemporary newspaper clipping or a single reference in a computer journal or gaming magazine. I've still got hundreds of old gaming magazines from the 80s and 90s taking up far too much room in my house. And I can't help thinking I would have come across Polybius at some point. And after all of this time, nobody has ever located the ROM image so that we can have a play on it ourselves on MAME. I would play this. I would have no compunction about not playing this. I'd just be like, no, I don't believe it. I'm going to play it. And I wouldn't have an epileptic fit. I wouldn't go missing. I wouldn't go get buried in the woods. Wait, was that this episode or was that another episode? There was some kid who ran away and got buried. He got taken to some tunnels. Was that this episode? I recorded 2 of these in a row. Oh, and there are plenty of people who claim to own the ROM, but they seem very cagey about sharing it, possibly because they're being very considerate and they don't want us to lose our minds. Yeah, or possibly just because they're bullshit artists who like attention. Or perhaps just edgy teenagers. And as nobody can agree on exactly how Polybius played, there are no surviving screenshots of the actual gameplay. That just leaves us with a single screenshot of a basic title screen, which could have been knocked up in an art package in 5 minutes by a highly trained seal. Like a aquatic seal, not a Navy SEAL. Speaking of gameplay, this widely shared memory of the game incorporating both vector and raster graphics at the same time just doesn't add up. It seems like people are conflating 2 games together in that case. As monitors could only be produced to exclusively handle one or the other, the manufacturers would have had to decide between the 2. Even the Rogue Synapse Tribute from 2007 could only make an attempt to simulate a vector display on a raster monitor and try to give the illusion of both, and there's no way this would have been possible in 1981. Vector monitors are now pretty much a thing of the past, and so when you're using an emulator to have a quick blast on a vintage vector title like Battlezone or Asteroids, you're not quite getting the full authentic effect. The emulator is simply converting the original vector graphics into rasterized images that can then be displayed on your modern raster monitor. I have no idea what any of that... I mean, I guess I know a little bit, like vector graphics are the ones that scale infinitely, and then I think when you rasterize something, it turns it into like a fixed number of pixels, right? That's what I know from Photoshop. I only discovered this a few years back when I came across an original Asteroids arcade machine and was blown away by how different it felt playing it to the emulated version on a PC. In fact, I became so immersed in it, I completely overlooked the entirely black machine parked right next to it, emitting an ominous hum. What else, Daddy? Was it surrounded by dudes in suits wearing CIA badges? But it's not feeling very promising when the one thing about the gameplay that most players can agree upon is that it would have been impossible. Maybe the Sinislosh & Company was just way ahead of its time, but another problem is that there's not a single trace of evidence that a company with that name ever existed anywhere on Earth. Wow. Okay, well, that's something. Perhaps it was an ultra-secret subsidiary of another company such as Atari, which was kept off the history books by the CIA. Or alternatively, it never existed. It turns out that Atari weren't exactly averse to creating secret and slightly dodgy subsidiaries during their very early days. The company often secured exclusivity contracts with certain arcade chains, which left many areas out in the cold as their smaller arcades were screaming out for those popular machines that Atari could not legally provide. So co-founder Nolan Bushell came up with a cunning idea of creating a new company in 1973 called Key Games, which would get around the exclusivity contracts by rolling out slightly inferior clones and modifications of the original arcade machines and pinball tables that were tied up in the deals. Kinda genius, dude. I mean, I like it. The contract wasn't tight enough to cover that, and that's a clever workaround. They were quite shady about it too, publicly announcing themselves as a direct competitor to Atari and claiming that some of the titles looked so similar because Atari developers were defecting to Key Games in their droves. Very nicely done. I don't know. I respect the business sense of this. They also produced a few original titles such as Tank, which funnily enough helped keep the parent company afloat during a period when Atari was experiencing financial issues. Wow, no one figured this out? Atari's a huge company, isn't it going to have like some sort of public books? But the game was up in 1978 after Atari was acquired by Warner Brothers, who closed down the dodgy offshoot. Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish and he'll spend a fortune on gear he uses about twice a year. I'm like reading this like it's part of the story, but I'm like, what is going on? And then I realized that it's just one of Danny's subliminal messages. If Atari really were the secret operators behind Sinneslöschen, this might explain the suspected involvement of Atari coder Ed Rodberg. That's an interesting theory. That's quite clever. I quite think this is possible. And there's an intriguing connection here with the theory that Polybius may have been part of a covert military recruitment drive. But it's appealing to 14-year-olds. It's easy to dismiss the whole concept as being ripped straight out of the plot of the 1984 film The Last Starfighter. In the movie, a teenager from a trailer park spends all his spare time on a fictional arcade machine called Starfighter, which later turns out to be a simulation test created by an alien defense force. When the teenager finally grabs the top high score on the machine, he's whisked away by the aliens to engage in interstellar war. Oh my god, have I never heard of this? The aliens come to Earth, it's like, no, we need a 14-year-old human to defeat our intergalactic alien foe. I mean, it was the 1980s, so I guess that's probably why this plot was okay. 1980s had some weird movies. As we mentioned before, Rogue Synapse went to the effort of creating a real Starfighter arcade machine much later in 2007, the same year they developed their tribute to Polybius. But whilst the idea of an alien defending force, or even a more human military force for that matter, making devious use of an arcade machine to recruit unsuspecting young players sounds more than a little far-fetched, doesn't it ever? It wouldn't be the first time that a video game company picked up a secretive government contract to develop training material wrapped up in an arcade cabinet. Just ask Atari and Ed Rodberg. Following the success of Rodberg's vector-based tank simulator Battlezone in 1980, the US Army asked Atari to develop a modified version to help soldiers learn how to get to grips with the new armored tracked vehicle known as the Bradley Fighting Vehicle. Seriously? That's pretty cool. Ed Rodberg wasn't mad keen on the idea as he was a pacifist who didn't want to train soldiers how to kill. But it turns out the army wasn't exactly after a simple blast 'em up either. In the end, Rodberg spent 3 months working on a much more complex version of the game with all kinds of extra buttons and sticks and knobs to help replicate the controls of a Bradley Fighting Vehicle. This is really cool. I really like that the military's just like, yeah, make this for us like back in the day. Because that can push games forward. And in this version, you didn't engage in battle with enemy tanks. The only way of losing was to either run out of ammo or accidentally shoot one of your own vehicles. Originally titled Army Battlezone before transforming into the Bradley Trainer, this cabinet was widely regarded as just another myth for many years before the truth finally began to emerge. And there's still a little mystery over what happens with the project after Rodberg completed the modifications. Only 2 cabinets were known to have been produced for certain, one of which went missing in action, whilst the other survives in a private collection. Whilst theories abound that Atari may have quietly produced thousands of these machines for the army in the early 80s, you'd have thought that a few more of them might have turned up after all this time. So it seems more likely that the project was just ultimately shelved. This would make the Bradley Trainer another pretty obscure game that was never released to the public at all, yet the ROM image exists and could be fired up on an emulator today to get a taste and feel of how it worked. It's not very playable though, as you really need all the unusually complex hardware that was bolted onto the original cabinet, so you'll probably have a lot more fun just shooting down baddies in the original Battlezone and then denouncing pacifism. Ed Rodberg doesn't like talking about the Bradley Trainer, as he never felt comfortable with the idea in the first place, but he's happy to at least admit that he was involved. In contrast, he's always denied any knowledge of Polybius, telling Den of Geek in 2009, quote, "I understand that my name has somehow gotten connected to this game. I can state with confidence that I never saw or heard of and certainly never worked on any game called Polybius. I have no reason not to believe him. He's cagey about the Bradley Trainer, but he's like, no, I did it. And if he's cagey about that and a little bit like, I don't know, I think he's just being straight up. I think he's just like, no, I didn't do it. And I believe him. There were plenty of other examples in later years of video games being specifically designed or tweaked for military training, including perhaps most famously of all, the PC title, Marine Doom. This was a modification of Doom 2, which was commissioned by the US Marine Corps in 1996. No. Oh, I'm sorry, I was like, Doom was made for this, but there's a specific Marine Doom. It was commissioned by the Marine Corps in 96 to help train 4-person fire teams, replacing the sci-fi scenarios and demon enemies with more realistic scenarios involving human opposition forces. I had no idea the military was up to this. That's really, I don't know if it's cool because it's like training people to kill, but it's also cool But it's not quite the same story with Polybius, which was supposedly a covert operation to identify potential new recruits rather than soldiers who had already sworn the oath and inked the pact. Yeah, again, and it just comes back to the fact that they're teenagers. They're like 14. The military's just not recruiting people that young. It seems like the sort of thing that teenagers would get all excited about and make up because they're teenagers and they're edgy. And as most people seem to remember, the Polybius was a particularly trippy and phantasmagorical space shooter. It's difficult to see how the military could have chosen this as the perfect recruitment test unless the players were really expected to engage in an interstellar conflict. What I was about to say. Well, the big alien invasion of the 80s where they needed starfighters. The other point is that whilst all the evidence has come to light about Atari's secret subsidy and their later contract with the military to produce training simulations, we're still completely in the dark about Polybius and Sinislotion. Even the name of the company doesn't make an awful lot of sense. Stephen Roach claimed that a German member of the team called Ulrich Koller came up with the name, although I think the most revealing thing is that Ulrich just happens to share a surname with Kurt Koller, the owner of the coinop.org database on which Roach was posting. It seems like a coincidence, but why would you make a mistake like that? Or wouldn't you just use a fake name? Brian Dunning of the Skeptoid podcast I haven't listened to the Skeptoid podcast in a long time. I should listen to that again. I remember it being very good. Has concluded that Sinislotion is a botched attempt by a non-German speaker to create a compound word using an English to German dictionary. To the native speaker, Sinislotion wouldn't really mean anything at all, as it would sound like something sense away removed. Okay. But it feels like the intention was to create a word that translated into English as sensory deprivation or sense delete, which would be an oddly unsettling name for a video game company and perhaps indicative that a prankster came up with it but didn't quite do enough homework for the joke to land. You could say something very similar about the name of the game itself. Polybius was indeed a Greek historian from the Hellenistic period, famed for his 40-volume work, The Histories. He hailed from Megalopolis in, wait for it, the region of Arcadia. Well, there you go. But he was also famous for putting forward his bold assertions that historians should ideally only attempt to chronicle events from first-hand accounts and that rigorous fact-checking, critical evaluation, and a commitment to truth should take priority over embellishments and hearsay and tell an engaging story. Nice little bit of irony there. Again, the choice of name does sound suspiciously like a hoaxster is either having a laugh or perhaps attempting to make some kind of point about the gullible souls who will believe any old shit without checking the reliability of the sources. Yeah, dude. Wait. Did this Polybius thing exist at all? I think it did, right? But that's I don't know, now I'm doubting it. Danny was very sure. When giving up your seat to a pregnant lady on the bus, first make sure they haven't just got a beer belly. God damn it, Danny. But hang on, what about the children that went missing or died after playing Polybius? Some of the parents might have been struggling to see the funny side of that. Well, let me just say it's probably because children didn't go missing and die after playing Polybius, and so there weren't any parents to complain about their children dying or going missing. While this largely amounts to little more than rumors and gossip on forums, and there's no contemporary news reports of gangs of children from Portland disappearing into thin air in 1981. Yes, we have the curious testimony of Bobby Feldstein, who shared his bizarre experiences in the 7-part Showcase podcast, the Polybius Conspiracy, in 2017. Yeah, but okay, so that was the kid who went and got buried in the woods in a bunker or whatever, so this was from this episode, and I think we wrote that off pretty much as just attention seeking. I remember thinking Bobby seemed like quite a nice chap, but, I don't think this happened, Bobster. But we also have Jacob Brogan from Slate.com to thank for later exposing that the podcast was largely just a load of old bollocks. Although it comes across as a serious, exhaustive documentary, Brogan began to brew a few suspicions about the authenticity of the material. So he got in touch with the podcast's executive producer, who cheerfully admitted that the podcast was a hybrid of fact and fiction, blending real interviews with a fictional narrative that is woven throughout the 7 episodes. I mean, yeah, it sounds like good material. It sounds fun. But it's not fact. This is not made remotely clear when you're listening to the podcast, and now we just have to guess which bits are genuine and which bits are horseshit, which doesn't really make for an entirely satisfying experience. But this probably goes some way to explaining why there is no evidence that Bobby Feldstein was even a real person, why some of his memories are demonstrably false, and why the podcast features interviews with journalists whose newspapers don't exist. As Jacob Brogan put it, it's hard to escape the feeling that the only real conspiracy here is the one against the audience. And it does feel as if there is quite a big dollop of deception at the heart of the Polybius machine, fueled by Mischief Makers' podcast productions and perhaps even our own unreliable memories to a certain degree. Bingo, Danny, that's what's going on. But I'm not suggesting that this is just another example of the Mandela effect, in which loads of people wrongly recall that Nelson Mandela served as president of South Africa in the 90s before his death in 2013, when we all know that he died in prison in the 1980s. I was like, wait, Daddy, what? Also, did Nelson Mandela really die 12 years ago? Holy shit. It could be the case that there are some genuine memories of some very real events at work here, but what exactly is everyone remembering? Midnight Resistance. One of the most obvious points to consider is that players are remembering a different game which had a limited or troubled release in the arcades. Tempest was released in the very same year that Polybius was supposedly rolled out in Portland, and there are elements of the Victor game which do share similarities with some descriptions of the gameplay. The issue here is that Tempest was certainly not an obscure or forgotten game. It was hugely influential and a lucrative title, which is often described as the best Vector game of all time. But Tempest designer and coder Dave Thurer did once reveal that an early prototype of the game had a very significant difference to the one that everybody played in the arcades, in which you move your blaster around quasi-3D tubes to shoot emerging enemies. In this prototype, twiddling the rotary knob didn't move your blaster at all. Instead, the blaster stayed glued to the same point on screen, whilst the whole landscape moved around it. Oh wait, isn't that how first-person shooter games work? I feel like that's how they work, and it's just like an effect that you think you're moving when really it's the scenery. I have to admit this sounds pretty awesome to me, and I imagine it would have been mind-blowing in 1981. Possibly a bit too mind-blowing. During playtesting, some of the gamers began to experience motion sickness, nausea, and vertigo, which led to a rethink from Atari. Yeah, there are some games on the VR headset, on the MetaQuest, that just make me very sick. I've played Population 1 officially once, because I started playing it, I felt like super motion sick after 2 minutes. I had to lie down for like half an hour. And I'm not like, I travel in cars fine, I travel in planes fine, boats fuck me up. But like, this was really unpleasant. Games can definitely do that. The theory goes that maybe some of these prototypes made it to Portland, and the unpaid playtesters were the customers at the arcades. However, there's no evidence to suggest that such a problematic prototype ever left Atari HQ. And whilst a ROM image of the early game exists, which was called Vortex, it's nothing like the version that Dave Thurer described. Video game researcher Patrick Kellogg feels it more likely that people are remembering a game that came along a little later in 1983. Cube Quest was an incredibly innovative shooter released by a little-known American company called Simutrek, which doesn't sound a million miles away from Sinnesloshen. Yeah, maybe. Often described as a spiritual successor to Tempest that was way ahead of its time, the game featured real-time 3D polygon graphics plastered over an animated laserdisc background, which certainly gave the game a unique look and feel, which would have dazzled the crowds of 1983. Not everyone managed to get to grips with it. The game has been described by critics as a poor version of Tempest, highly complicated for a mainstream electronic diversion, and here's one to raise an eyebrow to: visually stunning but hallucinogenic and neo-psychedelic. Alright. I bet if we played it today, we'd be like, yeah, I mean, it's fine. It ain't no Grand Theft Auto 6 though, is it? A more technical problem with Cube Quest is that the cutting-edge laserdisc technology was temperamental at best, and the cabinets received regular visits from technicians who were either attempting to repair them on site or conceding defeat and permanently removing the cabinets from arcades. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So whilst the date is a couple of years off, Cube Quest does seem to fill other slots of the story, as it was a distinctive and revolutionary psychedelic shooter produced by an obscure company. It didn't hang around in the arcades for very long, and it was regularly visited by mysterious men who occasionally dragged the cabinets away in silence. This sounds like it. This sounds like the Polybius machine did exist. You know, people remember it, but it was Cube Quest. The silence may not have been sinister in nature, it's just that video game technicians aren't usually very chatty, especially when they're having to deal with hordes of sweaty kids asking questions. Yeah, look, if it was my job to go into an arcade and remove arcade machines, I'd just be like, I'm going to go in and remove the arcade machines. I don't want to hang out with all the sweaty kids asking me questions about arcade machines. I'd just be like, get in the fucking van and let's go. It smells of teenagers in here. But there was still other genuinely sinister stuff going down in the arcades of the early 1980s, and believe it or not, there may have well been groups of undercover agents prowling those neon-lit arenas in which the kids were dropping like flies. Okay, but they're not going to be wearing suits and looking like G-men. The gaming scene was very different back in those early years. The old fogies who insist on grumbling about how things were different back in the day are now growing increasingly concerned that these newfangled video gaming machines were inherently evil and destroying the minds and souls of our children. Parent watch groups were calling for youngsters to be banned from the arcades as the games were deemed to be addictive, violent, encouraging kids to gamble, teaching them to worship Satan, all right, making them ill, and turning their brains into mushy peas. You never got any of those dramatic side effects with a hoop and a stick. No, it's also hoop and stick's a lot more boring. These campaigners were taken quite seriously in some quarters, and the city of Mesquite in Texas briefly imposed an arcade ban on under-17s. Other places looked likely to follow until the ban was legally challenged by Atari and struck down by the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, with the Supreme Court later declining to make a ruling on the matter in 1982. Yeah, so the Supreme Court basically agrees. They're like, no, we're not going to touch that one, it seems right. We're not even going to consider it. Of course, there's no denying that playing arcade games can make you ill, particularly if you spend hours and hours staring at the same screen with flashing lights and swirling colors and whistles and bells. Yeah, I can agree with that. I think like my experience playing Population 1 on the VR, it's like, oh god. There's nothing massively surprising about that. It's just that playing anything for prolonged periods in an overzealous bid to topple the high score could easily cause fatigue, migraines, motion sickness, eye strain, headaches, snout, fever, don't know what that is, and a lot more beside. The risks are only increased if you're shoveling nothing but sugary drinks and shitty snacks down your throat during your efforts to get the top score on Crystal Castles. This is obviously not the fault of the video game or the manufacturer, but entirely the responsibility of the player who needs to take a good hard look at his reflection in the mirror. Yeah, or the parents to be like, less time at the arcade, more time outside. Oh god, I'm sounding like a parent already, aren't I? I would have wished my parents be like, no, like my parents used to say, you can only play this much video games a day. And all I wanted to do was play video games, and then I could go outside. It was stupid outside with the fucking lame-ass fresh air. And there were several instances in the 1980s when some players went way too far and suffered the consequences. For example, there was an incident that occurred in the Malibu Grand Prix arcade in Portland, Oregon, on the 27th of November 1981. A 12-year-old kid named Brian Mauro was having a go at beating the world record for asteroids. This had previously been set by a 16-year-old who had racked up a score of over 30 million during a session that lasted a mind-boggling 52 hours. Wait, he stood at that arcade machine playing asteroids for 52 hours without a break. What, did he wear a nappy? Did he shit his pants? What's happening? A local TV crew tagged along to Malibu Grand Prix to film this fresh attempt to break the record as Brian's dad stood by his son's side at all times in support. And Brian was doing pretty well for himself too. Just a single quarter had seen him hog the asteroid machine for 28 hours, which certainly represents good value for money, but also throws up several questions in my mind. For starters, how's that even possible? I've been playing asteroids for decades, but I find it difficult to survive any longer than about 10 minutes. Could it be that at one point the game caps out? Isn't that the case with Tetris, which is like famously competitively played, where after a while the blocks don't start falling any quicker? And I imagine with asteroids, after a while the asteroids don't get any faster or whatever. Is that how asteroids works? You got to blast the space rocks and then blast the little bits that blast off the space rocks, right? At some point I feel like it must cap out and just be like, okay, that's maximum difficulty, and then it's just like you just keep playing. Secondly, what did he do for toilet breaks? Exactly. It's not as if these arcade machines had a pause button. Was his dad standing by with 2 buckets so that he could do his business in front of the entire arcade and the local TV crew, whilst keeping both hands on the control panel? An even more worrying thought would be the kind of food and drink that Brian consumed whilst undergoing this 28-hour marathon. And this would prove to be his downfall. Brian was dressed in a tuxedo, okay, as he battled bravely on while suffering occasionally from hand cramps. He eventually bowed out with severe stomach pains, having accrued a perfectly respectable or arguably slightly bonkers score of 14 million. I don't know if I assume that's extremely good, but I have literally no reference point for this. The Eugene Register newspaper reported that Brian was suffering from serious gastrointestinal upset after having consumed excessive amounts of nothing but cola and orange juice over those grueling 28 hours. Bro, that sounds horrible. He was confined to bed for the next 2 days, during which he was only able to take small sips of soup through a straw. Brian got injured during esports. But here's where things get really weird. Another arcade-related illness was reported on that very same day in 1981 in the very same state of Oregon. Strike me pink, it was even the very same Malibu Grand Prix arcade in Portland. And this time, the game at the heart of the incident was Tempest. This particular incident was far more low-key, and it didn't involve any reckless attempt to break a world record whilst downing cola and orange juice. It was just a 14-year-old kid called Michael Lopez trying to enjoy a game of Tempest with a small group of his mates. But during Michael's turn, he suddenly began to develop an uncomfortable sensation as if little lights were flashing within his brain. He stumbled away from the machine and was violently sick in the parking lot before he attempted to make his way home. So, is he having, I don't know what an epileptic fit feels like, but this sounds like it could be an epileptic fit. He didn't quite make it though. A neighbor made a call to police after he witnessed Michael writhing around and screaming in agony on his front lawn. Michael Lopez fully recovered from the experience and now owns a nightclub in Seattle. Well, good for him. This was his first ever migraine attack, which became a fairly regular occurrence ever since playing that game of Tempest. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, that does really sound like a migraine. I've had one migraine in my life. I don't know why, I don't know how, but I was just like, oh yeah, migraines, bad headaches. And then I was like, holy shit, I understand. And I was like, please don't let this be the beginning of something. And that was, I don't know, years ago, 7-8 years ago now, and never had another one since. So I'm like, bullet dodged, because it was fucking unpleasant. And now when people tell me they have a migraine, I'm like, I understand, go chill. That's not to pile any blame on Atari. All kinds of perfectly innocent stuff can act as an unfortunate first-time trigger for a migraine. But it's the aftermath of the incident that may be significant, as the news of Michael's experience with Tempest was reported in local newspapers and rumors began to swirl around Portland about this new nightmare game. Okay, I'm beginning to realize what's happened. Lots of different memories have been conflated, and then lots of pot stirrers have just come in and made some stuff up. I think that's what's happened, essentially. I would say that to the point that I would be surprised if it was something other than that. Much later in 2012, Michael explains the turn of events to Retrocade magazine, quoting him, "My friends were totally weirded out. They were convinced the game had damaged me. When I got back to school, people were talking about how the game was dangerous. Every time I got a migraine after that, they would say, 'Man, that game messed you up.' There were kids at school who, after hearing about what had happened to me, would not play it. They'd play every other game but that one. They actually thought it would damage your brain. But then there were the guys who now wanted to play it. It became like a challenge or something. But it was hard to find after that. It just kind of disappeared for a while." End quote. Whilst the two kids in Portland thankfully survived their ordeals in Malibu Grand Prix arcades, it's often reported that two other kids weren't so lucky when they dared to play the classic 1980 maze shooter Berserk. But a little bit of digging has revealed that the whole idea of Berserk being responsible for the deaths of two kids is a little bit off beam. Whilst it's often documented that a young kid called Jeff Daly collapsed and died from a heart attack while playing Berserk just a week after the two incidents in Portland, there's no contemporary evidence to indicate that this ever happened. There are a few more grains of truth in the case of 18-year-old Peter Bukowski, who apparently died of a heart attack shortly after beating the high score on the Berserk machine in Friar Tuck's game room in Calumet City, Illinois. This led newspapers questioning whether the intensity and stress of the game was responsible for Peter's death. A kid having a heart attack, something's wrong with his heart, right? He's got a medical condition. But in fact, Peter's heart had been riddled with scar tissue for a while, there you go. And whilst it's possible that playing the game may have been a trigger on that day, he was tragically just a young man with a weak heart. The owner of Friar Tuck's game room, Tom Blankley, wasn't especially sensitive in his appraisal of the situation when he cheerfully told the local rag, "The player's heart had a time bomb that just happened to go off here. I expected it to hurt business, but if anything, business has gone up." Well, that's good to know, Tom. You douchebag, allegedly. The designer of Berserk, Alan McNeil, later claimed Tom had privately recalled a slightly different version of events in which Peter had barely even started up his game before he died, and he was already panting for breath after running up the stairs to get to the cabinet. All these reports only helped to give more weight to the idea that video games were lethal and were killing our children, even though we're actually talking about a kid gorging on cola and orange juice for 24 hours, a boy suffering his first migraine, a completely fake story, and a man who died from a pre-existing heart condition whilst he just happened to be playing a game. Yep, completely agree. It's all just hysteria. But even though video games were still perceived to be dangerous, they weren't the most truly dangerous things you could find in 1980s arcades. Maybe it really is time to call in the Men in Black to deal with this one. Rolling Thunder. The men in black, who were regularly spotted mooching about the arcades, were most likely not associated with Project MKUltra or any other government-sanctioned mind control program, largely because Project MKUltra officially ran between 1953 and 1973 before its scandalous exposure in 1975. It seems improbable that the CIA would have resorted to similar dirty tactics on US citizens 8 years after the closure of Project MKUltra, and even if they did, I'm not convinced that shoving a few dodgy arcade games in Portland would have been top of the priority list. But that's not to say that there weren't agents of the law sneaking around the arcades in 1981 and playing their own tricks on the customers and the business owners, but with perfectly legitimate reasons. It's tempting to think of the arcade venues of yesteryear, or slotties, as the deprived people of the UK call them. Really? People in the UK called arcade slotties? I've never heard the word slotties before. As enchanting halls of childhood innocence in which the most controversial thing to happen is probably a kid getting a bit lippy because he put 10 pence in a Frogger machine that conked out on him. Yet the arcades of the US in the early 1980s were apparently amongst the seediest places on earth, where drug deals were going down next to the track and field machine, pickpockets were lurking in every corner, gangsters were cooking up nefarious plans whilst pretending to have a go on moon patrol, and arcade owners were repurposing the machines for illegal gambling. Wait, is this true or is this just made up? Like, arcades where children go to play games were like where criminal activity happens? I mean, pickpocketing, sure, but drug deals? Nefarious plans? Like, really? The darkness and noise of a typical arcade venue made it a perfect location for crime to quietly unfold in the deafening shadows. Okay. The thing about the illegal gambling is particularly interesting. Gambling was tightly regulated in most US states in 1981, and if you had a little flutter on a blackjack or draw 80 poker machine, the only prizes on offer were the non-monetary variety such as points, credits, or occasionally a ticket which could be redeemed for the kind of shitty objects you pick up in a claw machine if they weren't all bloody rigged. This was naturally quite off-putting for hardcore gamblers who were only interested in winning cold hard cash that they could fritter away on the same machine for the next half an hour. Yeah, I don't understand gambling. I'm like, okay, so gambling. I go into an establishment and I walk out with less money, statistically, over time. I just don't get it. Lottery, I get. I don't play the lottery, but I understand the appeal because it's like, oh, it's exciting. The chances are really small. You're never going to go broke playing the lottery. It's like £1 a week or whatever. Maybe it's £1.50 now, inflation. But I don't know, I understand that. This could be a little bit exciting. I played the lottery a few times, but regular gambling, I just don't really understand. Some of the more devious arcade owners installed an illegal counter within such games, which was usually wired to a back bar. When the player racked up more than the legal limit of 15 crappy wins, they would be paid in cash behind the bar for any additional winnings that had been recorded by the counter, incentivizing the players to keep on shoving their money into the machines. This kind of activity was kicking off all over the place, but it seemed like a particularly big problem in Portland, and within just weeks of the two incidents of Brian Mora and Michael Lopez both falling in on the same day, the FBI raided several arcades throughout Portland, poked around in the back of the gambling cabinets to seek and remove illegal counters, and made a total of 52 arrests. That's not all the FBI were doing. In quite a head-scratching move, they were wandering around the arcades of Portland, taking photographs of some of the high score tables in the hope that this might help them track down eyewitnesses that might prove useful in an ongoing investigation. What, the high score holders? But the thing is, they used to have just 3 initials. They're all going to be filled like either DIK, SEX, That's the only reason you wanted the high score. This sounds a bit batty to me, as I'm not sure how many fresh leads they would have gleaned from the names or initials on the high score tables, which only allowed a maximum of 3 letters exactly. If they'd tried doing this anywhere near my home in the UK, they'd have been attempting to track down hundreds of people, either called bum, tit, or poo. Yes, exactly. A slightly more sophisticated and smarter initiative by the FBI was to hide secret cameras and microphones within certain cabinets around the US. The idea was that if a gang of crooks were discussing an upcoming drug deal or bank job or fish market heist whilst crowded around a crazy climber cabinet, their conversations would be filmed and recorded and they'd be stitched up like a kipper. One such operation in Seattle led to the arrest of 25 suspects and the retrieval of stolen goods with a value of over $1 million today. Holy shit, pretty impressive. This actually really worked. The cabinets were chosen for practical reasons rather than popularity. The FBI figured that the games with smoky glass bezels bordering the monitor were the best ones in which to discreetly install recording equipment, and the top 3 candidates to fall into this category were Scramble, Galaxian, and our old friend Tempest. In fact, the FBI seized so many Tempest cabinets for modifications in the sting operations that it led to a shortage of Tempest games within the arcades of Portland. If I was the owner of the arcade or the manufacturer of Tempest, I'd be like, bruh, come on. You're ruining my business. No. And now all of the pieces of the psychedelic jigsaw are beginning to fit together in a way that might paint a more accurate picture of the true story behind Polybius. If I was an illegal gambling man, I'd bet my last quarter that Polybius never existed in any shape or form, and that it was a prank first put together by Kurt Koller of the CoinOp database around 1998. Wait, I thought Danny started this episode saying he was sure it existed. The whole idea behind the prank was probably just to increase traffic to the database, which I imagine worked a treat when the myth finally made it into the mainstream in GamePro magazine in 2003. I also strongly suspect that the messages from the supposed developer Stephen Roach was just an extension of the gag, which has Kurt Koller's digital footprints all over it. What I'm less sure about is whether this was an incredibly clever hoax inspired by a combination of real historical events, or whether the joke just accidentally expanded into something way bigger than Kurt could have imagined at the time. Bearing in mind how much he messed up the translation of the fictional company Sinneslotion, I would take a guess at the former. But whether intentional or not, Kurt Koller triggered genuine memories of real events which just got a little muddied along the way and convinced so many people that a game called Polybius really was warping people's minds in 1981 before it was taken away by the Men in Black. Some players will remember the days when federal agents were prowling around arcades, poking around with certain machines and silently observing the scene. Other players will remember the silent technicians who were paying frequent attention to a game called Cube Quest, which bore many similarities to the vague descriptions of Polybius and disappeared from arcades very quickly as it kept breaking down. Whilst it seems unlikely that a prototype of Tempest ever made it into the arcades, Portland players in particular may recall that the standard version of Tempest did a similar vanishing act from their local arcades after the cabinets were nabbed by the FBI for sting operations. Portland players may also recall that night in 1981 when two kids became ill whilst in Malibu Grand Prix Arcade, with one case fueling rumors that Tempest was a nightmare game which sent you mad. The not entirely accurate subsequent reports of people dying whilst playing Berserk may have also helped to perpetuate the notion that a dangerous video game was let loose in the early 80s and was taking the lives of children. Yep, so this is just a huge conflation of a whole bunch of different things. And all these memories got mashed up, there we go, into conspiratorial recipe, which was also peppered with the later revelations that Atari had made secret deals with the government to produce cabinets for the US military. In a sense, the only things missing from the real story of Polybius is a company called Sinneslotion and Polybius itself. But while Polybius cabinets went on to make subtle cameo appearances in the works of fiction such as The Simpsons, Loki, and Wreck-It Ralph, which is the greatest film of the millennium so far, Danny's opinion, the odds of stumbling across one in real life are far higher than managing to get more than half an hour's entertainment out of Space Invaders. Quote, "If history is deprived of the truth, we are left with nothing but an idle, unprofitable tale." That's not another subliminal message. It's a quote from some Greek guy who went by the name of Polybius. That's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to get a signed version of this script, which I didn't sign at the beginning, which I shall do now, you can follow the link below to the merch store and pick it up. Signed. Live on camera. All of the scripts genuinely used on camera. One-of-a-kind items. There's a link below. And thanks for watching.